Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Katie O'Connor, and I'm the Marketing Coordinator for AFG Group, Inc. I'm also on the board of SME Mid-Maryland as the Communications Chair for this year. The Society of American Military Engineers' mission is to lead collaborative efforts to identify and resolve national security infrastructure-related challenges. If you'd like to hear more information on becoming a member of SAME or request a PDH for this webinar, please connect with us through our website at same.org/mid-Maryland. As you know, COVID-19 has put a significant crimp on our planned events. As such, the Mid-Maryland Post has decided to temporarily transition to hosting educational events through video conferencing. We're very excited to host our 5th webinar with GHC. We'll be discussing the topic of DoD critical systems testing and integrated commissioning processes. Please be advised that we are recording the session and will provide a link to the recording slides to all attendees via the email used to sign up for the event. Let me introduce you to our speakers who will step you through some webinar logistics. Matt Pauley is a fire protection engineer for GHC in Baltimore, Maryland. He serves as an engineer of record for multiple NAVFAC projects serving both NAVFAC Washington and NAVFAC Mid-Atlantic. Dylan Desimone is a senior project manager for GHC. He has experience in mechanical design, commissioning, forensic engineering, and construction management for a wide variety of projects, including mechanical, electrical, fire protection, and plumbing systems for 100+ military, water, wastewater, mining, industrial, energy, and data center projects. Without further delay, here are Matt and Dylan.
Thank you, Katie. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Looks like we got about 14, 15 people. Doesn't really actually count them, but we'll try to keep this fairly informal. I think everybody should have the ability to chime in they want. So if you got any questions or want to discuss something further, just go ahead and unmute, chime in, and we'll take it from there. So let me jump over to the presentation. Dylan, I think you got request control. There you are.
Yep, good to go.
All right.
Sounds good. So this is on DoD system testing and the integrated commissioning process, which has been evolving over the past couple of years. Let's see, let me click through here. We're going to cover what is commissioning, some of the key deliverables, how it's changed recently, commissioning critical systems specifically, how it relates to the NFPA 3 and 4, which have come out in the past 3 to 4 years, and they've just been updated recently as well on some guidelines, and then the standard commissioning roles and responsibilities and some lessons learned on the commissioning process. So what is commissioning? If you can give a very simple definition, it's the verification and documentation that the systems that are within your building or facility operate, and that you can go back and check the documentation and verify that that's happened. Whether they be mechanical, electrical, plumbing, fire protection, it's all going to be designed and noted down to an owner's performance requirements in the design documentation that's created at the start of the project. The commissioning, as you call it, is the process, the pre-functional checklist, the functional checklist, which we'll cover later. The functional testing, the verbiage for the functional testing is actually the event, getting out in the field, running the units, taking down measurements, and verifying that it actually works. So those two, and Matt will touch on this later. That's where the commissioning process on the DoD side, the verbiage is different depending on who you talk to, whether it's commissioning a unit or doing commissioning.
And I'll chime in here, Dylan. This was a big discussion we had with NAVFAC fire protection, was this concept of process versus event. So the term commissioning in the fire protection world really gets morphed or misinterpreted to that acceptance testing. So in the fire protection world and in the UFGS specs, you'll see the terminology of acceptance testing, which that's really the event. That's the event at the end of the project where you're testing the system. When we refer to this commissioning, we're talking of the process that leads up so that you have a successful event at the end. Dylan, do you want to explain a little bit about the commission authority versus agent? Dylan? Did we lose Dylan or did we lose me?
No, you're there, Matt. I don't see Dylan anymore. You might have lost connection.
Okay. All right. Hold on. All right. I'll try to pick up Dylan's slides here. So like I was saying, the commissioning it's a process. So we get into some of the deliverables, the owner's project requirements. That's going to be what the government for this. So for this whole presentation, we've really kind of wrapped this around DoD and most specifically NAVFAC. So the commission delivers the OPR, the owner's project requirements. Is what the NAVFAC is going to end up giving to the AE team or design build team. They're going to turn that around, develop a base of design, which is going to be the AE's understanding of what the requirements were and how they came up with the design, which helps out with the construction aspect of things. So you can actually test per the base of design. And then at the tail end, you're going to be getting the systems manual, which is kind of covers all the everything that was installed. So this commissioning process, it's really a life cycle process. It's going to start all the way from design stage, even before the design stage through concept. You're going to see it gas through into construction and then to the formal testing at the end. But again, this is where we're making a big difference, that it's not just the testing at the end of the project, it's the process all the way through the project that is being wrapped up into this commissioning mindset. So where's this commissioning coming from? We've been kind of seeing this term getting thrown around in the industry. It's getting more and more adopted by other trades outside of HVAC. So for HVAC, commissioning's been their process for turning over those systems for quite some time. Now this idea of commissioning is being picked up in some of the USACE and some of the UFGS specs. I think previously the commissioning was only an HVAC spec, as is today, and this is where I wish I had Dylan's notes in front of me, but I believe it has moved up into more of like an 01 specification, where it's not just covering HVAC systems, it's covering the project. So it can be that commissioning aspect can be used to be covered multiple aspects of a project rather than just HVAC. So we're seeing more and more DoD agencies specifically that are picking these up. There's the Division 1 spec that I was referring to. We're also seeing USACE and NAVFAC releasing engineering construction bulletins. And what these are, I don't know if anybody's really familiar with them. So they're not UFCs. They're not unified facility criteria. They're engineering construction bulletins are more of guidelines for USACE and NAVFAC to follow. So where we're actually seeing these requirements kind of come to the AE or to the contractor is USACE and NAVFAC are developing them into the scope of work. So obviously not all projects are going to require commissioning. It's going to depend a lot on the complexity of the project. So if the, I won't say design team. Hey,
this is
Dylan's back.
I had to use my cell phone mobile hotspot. I don't know what my internet's doing.
All right. Well, I got through most of your slides, so
I appreciate that.
You can do mine today if you want. So I was just talking about the engineering construction bulletins and how, they're not design criteria for the design firm, but they're more of a guideline for NAVFAC or USACE to build that into the scope of work for a project depending on the complexity of that project.
Yeah, and just to talk about our current project with NAVFAC, that's a discussion that the commissioning authority has with the owner to determine what's going to be the biggest benefit and bang for their buck on the commissioning, whether it's required, which is typically there's not a code requirement for commissioning, but there could be some really useful systems for commissioning, and especially for the documentation side that they're looking for, and that's all determined at the start of the project.
Oh, you don't have control. There you go.
Yep. So this was one of the ECBs that we had referenced for some of the NAVFAC work that was issued in a couple years ago that referenced a lot of the critical systems that the Navy was having consistent issues with over the life cycle of some of this equipment. This is what we mean when we say critical equipment. This is what they've identified as saying these items, and not just this list, but these cover most of them. These are giving us the most heartburn, and where we feel that the commissioning process, some of the documentation, some of the additional training and training documentation, and then the systems manual at the end is going to be helpful to sort of give them a more fuller picture of how to operate it over the lifetime of the units.
And I think it should be noted here from some of our discussions with at least the NAVFAC fire group is that ECB is their almost internal bulletin. So for the most part, it's their internal requirement for the NAVFAC people to pay close attention and to, you know, make sure that the testing and quote unquote commissioning of these systems are done to make sure at turnover they're getting exactly what they originally asked for. So the AE team, the construction team, they may not have any commissioning requirements for it. However, it can be built into the contract if NAVFAC or USACE puts it in there for you to do it themselves. But for the most part, at least from the fire group, their mindset is currently that they are that make sure I use the right word, commissioning authority. So they're overseeing that as it's going through the design process and into construction, and that they're monitoring all of that from a quote unquote commissioning process standpoint, so that at the end it's turned over properly.
Yep. Yep, and that I'm not sure if you touched on it, but that commissioning plan that's issued in the beginning will lay out those reporting structures and guidelines, which is going to vary from NAVFAC to USACE and some of the other federal agencies that are operating under some of the newer guidelines, not really standards. So NFPA 3 and 4, these are the new guidelines that were issued, I think in 2016 or 17. Pretty simple. NFPA 3 is the standard for commissioning of them. NFPA 4 is the actual integration of the multiple systems. So we'll have a diagram here that we're going to show you in a second that'll help explain that. So the NFPA 3 will explain the commissioning process, especially to the fire protection side that doesn't typically do the commissioning side. I know, Matt, you having run into the first couple projects for commissioning, there's a lot of questions that come up on different things, especially overlap on some of the acceptance testing that mirrors some of the commissioning functional testing, which there's definitely an overlap, and the testing should take place at the same time. Something like the AFFF system or some of the other larger items that if you're shutting down an area, you don't want to shut it down twice to do two similar tests. You're just going to mold your commissioning test to sort of be very friendly with your acceptance testing. So the NFPA 4, it doesn't mandate the testing, but it's just another guideline in the interaction between the commissioning of each one of the units. It'll outline the specific test scenarios that it'll give you. I think this spec will give you some of the pre-functional and functional checklists for the integration on how you can do a more complicated, more in-depth system, which we'll have an example of here shortly.
Yeah, I'll take over. No, we'll go back to it.
Yeah.
So, wanted to point out, so we've been talking a lot of DoD, NAVFAC, USACE requirements. So this is an NFPA document. This NFPA 4 is actually being referenced in the newer editions of both IBC and NFPA 101. So, Dylan, you got to mute yourself when you put that thing down.
Sorry.
So even in the commercial world where, your IBCs and your 101s are being adopted, you're going to start to see these requirements come up. So for right now, this integrated testing requirement, you're going to see it for high rise and smoke control systems. So, and what this does is your high rise and your smoke control systems, they're 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 going to have systems that are multiple disciplines coming together to make an entire overall system work. So for high rise, you're going to have a fire alarm system tied into a stair pressurization system or an elevator pressurization system. For smoke control, that's your HVAC is tied with your fire alarm. You may have dampers, controls, all sorts of different things. The best way I can explain this is from a DoD standpoint is you have a bunch of different systems covered in different division specifications. So they're in Division 28, they're in Division 23 for mechanical HVAC.
Yep.
So, and so you got all these different divisions, who's looking over to make sure all of those aspects are coming together at the end of the project to make sure they all work together.
And that was one of the things you touched on probably just as soon as I dropped off. That's why it moved from HVAC commissioning in Division 23 to a Division 1 spec for total building commissioning, because all of the contractors need to see that commissioning guidance and know that it applies to them and not just Division 23 now.
So, and this next slide really just kind of captures that whole integrated test of what we're talking about. So, when you have a smoke control or high rise or the project that we're currently working on for the Navy for this is a hangar system. So we have a fire alarm system that is really controlling and the backbone of how everything works. But then we also have a releasing system, which is separate from the fire alarm system. So those two systems have to work together. They also have to work with the flow control valves that are operating the system. We also have a containment system that once the AFFF suppression system discharges and goes through the trenches and out of the building, that we actually contain that into a containment tank buried underground rather than go into sanitary. So all these systems are covered in different division specs throughout the project. However, when we get to the final acceptance test, we want to make sure we have a commissioning plan that's verifying that each one of these subsystems are coming together to work properly and meet the design intent that was originally asked for. So this kind of is that gives you a breakdown of what we'd be looking for. So this is for the hangar project. So functional testing is pretty much we light up a pan fire inside the hangar bay to make sure the IR detector activates. That's the functional testing of the IR detector. All right, so what's integrated testing? Well, what happens downstream of that? What are the outputs from that IR detector going into alarm that is actually supposed to activate? So most times when you're testing a fire alarm system, sometimes not everything else is hooked up and ready to go. You might be waiting on equipment, you might be waiting for power to get turned on or something to be done. So a lot of the times they'll just be looking to make sure that their module activates, which is they're looking at the LED light to see that thing goes on. Well, we want to make sure that the entire system is actually functioning the way it should. So we want to make sure that that red light and turn on that module is actually activating what it's supposed to, and it's closing those containment systems and activating that bypass to where the effluent's supposed to go into the containment tank. So we're talking about commission of fire protection life safety system. So what does all that include? So this is a broad list of quite a few things. So if you notice a lot of the stuff on the left side that's going to fall under mostly your Division 21 specification requirements. When you get into the storage tanks, they're going to be, probably in a civil spec. We get over to some of the items on the right-hand column, and these are actually a lot more of your architectural features. So these may be up in the front end specs in your 07, your 08s, and things like that. Some electrical, your emergency lighting, all this stuff is in NAVFAC's mind covered under the fire protection engineer's responsibility of performing a life safety plan and making sure all this is coming together. Well, how do we translate that into the commissioning world? So one of the things that NAVFAC specifically does is they have a quality control requirement for a fire protection engineer. One of the problems that I've seen and come across on that is the requirements for that fire protection engineer are not well defined. So how do we improve on that process and get from a quality control fire protection engineer that is not defined to defining the exact requirements in construction that that individual is responsible for to make sure it all comes together? So verifying that all the emergency lighting is installed properly. This is obviously going to have overlap onto the electrical requirements, but same thing for fire and smoke dampers. Now, granted, majority of those are going to be tied into your fire alarm system, so that's going to fall under the QCFB's requirements. Same thing, smoke control. But fire stopping, that's a Division 07, But then again, fire stopping typically has a special inspector requirement. So I think I glossed over that earlier. Dylan, did you have anything to talk about for difference between special inspectors and CX or?
No, not necessarily. I mean, the acceptance testing is going to be a code-driven item or a life safety of building, somebody signing off on a certificate of occupancy, where your commissioning authority is going to be more along the lines of you're meeting the owner's project requirements. The commissioning authority is being paid by the owner to make sure that they're getting what they signed up for and what was designed. So it's sort of two different end goals, and that would be the difference versus the code and life safety versus an owner's project requirements is what they're aiming for.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yep. So, any questions so far? I know I'm rolling through this pretty quick, especially since Dylan dropped off. I blew through his slides awfully fast.
We can go back and touch on those too.
Yeah. So now we're getting into some of the commission responsibilities. Dylan, do you want to take back over for these slides? This is more
Yeah, this is more commissioning process. Yeah. So this so on the commissioning side, this is where the difference, I mean, this is basically our conversation a second ago here. They're going to have the AHJ, who that's going to be on the life safety elements and the code requirements. The DOR on the commissioning side is going to be the engineer record, and then the contractor is going to be the person actually doing the tests. So they're going to be partners with the commissioning authority. The contractor is going to assume basically the commissioning agent's roles as the person who's actually operating some of the equipment during the functional testing. But all of these are important roles that are going to be through the construction of the project, from design through construction. And this is what we were talking about before. There's not a code requirement for commissioning. There's some lead requirements that commissioning gets you some points, but there's no code anywhere that's requiring it. So the client's going to determine the level of complexity of commissioning that they're going to want. If it's a small 12 by 12 building out in the middle somewhere with a single split system unit, you're probably not going to commission that. If there's a lot of complexity, a hangar, for example, or there's some big schools that we've done where that you have 50, 60 different types of units spread throughout the campus. Like, you're going to want to have some documentation, so when the contractor walks away and your 1-year warranty's up, you're going to know what you have and how to maintain it. So UFC, that you may be able to touch on that one a little bit more, but that may drive and assist what the commissioning agent is out there to commission, to sort of help that that AHJ and the owner make sure that they meet those requirements, and then also how the contracts how the project is contracted, which I think the following slides will
So
touch on that as well.
I think one thing we need to clarify, Dylan, is that at UFC 421101, I don't think there's any specific reference to commissioning and
No.
using that terminology. So this is, and again, this is, Dylan and I on the outside kind of looking into this process, this idea of commissioning and how it's kind of getting morphed over into the fire protection world and these other critical systems that we're seeing. So we've seen the UFGS specification requirement get moved. We've seen some of these ECBs now coming out that are talking and requiring NAVFAC to have commissioning processes in place, whether that's done in-house or kicked to the AE team. But it's being done. But as far as we know, we aren't seeing any UFC currently setting design criteria that would kick in commissioning requirements.
Not on the fire and life safety side. There's some energy usage that may require it for total building commissioning, but not on the fire and life safety side right now.
Okay, so that's and that's what we're seeing is this kind of this mind shift change and development of codes. So we're kind of just doing this presentation as we're not sure what's going to happen and what's going to be required, but it's changing. So just be aware of those scope of works and what's being put out there and what kind of impact this has, because it's extensive process when you get into it, especially when you get into these complex systems and integrated systems.
Yeah, and just to touch on that too, just if you have your commissioning authorities or commissioning firms that you use, it's a good idea to reach out to them to see if they have the capability and the capacity, because typically that's not been in their wheelhouse. So as some of these NFPA 3 and NFPA 4 guidelines evolve, then that may be something that they grow into as well. But they may be nervous going into a fire and life safety situation. So that would be good to discuss with them now, rather than when you're pricing up a project and you're trying to squeeze your MEP commissioning only into a fire protection and life safety role too.
You want to take lead on contracting?
This one's all you.
All right, so we're just going to quick go over some of the different contracting ways that we've been seeing how this has all been broken down. So there's going to be different approaches. So design build approach, you could have one contract or two contracts. So the owner could go out and for approach one, it'd be two separate contracts. They're going to have a commissioning contract so that it's completely independent from the design build contract. Or you can have just a single contract and put that commissioning requirement built into that design build contract.
And we've seen both.
For design bid build, this is where it's going to get a little more interesting. So you could have most common is the owner goes out and they have a commissioning contract that is completely separate from the design contract and the general contractor. So what they'll allow them to do is this commissioning contract would then almost be overarching and have a timeline that lapse from the AE design contract over into the general contract. That way the commissioning contractor is then through the whole lifespan of that contract. Different from that would be just having the two separate contracts where the AE design contract includes the commissioning contract. And again, then the AE would then carry over into the construction with CA services, and then that CX portion of that contract gets pulled over into the construction aspect.
Yep, and just to touch on that, go back. So the CX contract is typically you'll do the design and the construction side, but that's not necessarily the case sometimes. Sometimes you'll only be brought on board for the construction phase, and that's referenced as fundamental commissioning, where if you're on for the design phase as sort of the independent QA/QC as the owner's rep almost, that's enhanced commissioning is what that's known as. So at least using some of the old lead terms that will give you different credits for those two. So now Matt's favorite slide.
So this is my wonderful slide with regard to the acronyms. So I'm not really sure who's on the list, but normally when you're talking NAVFAC, they love their acronyms. So the biggest issue that I'm seeing, and this gets into that whole quality control fire protection engineer and what all that means. The latest UFC 3600-01, which is the fire protection code criteria for DoD. They've defined the QFP as the qualified fire protection engineer, and they also have a DFP, which is a designated fire protection engineer. The designated fire protection engineer is your NAVFAC fire protection engineer that oversees the project. Your qualified fire protection engineer is most of the time designer of record. So they're the one that is overseeing the AE project or on the AE team and actually signing and sealing those documents. However, the way the UFC is written, they want that qualified FPE to almost go over into the construction aspect of it. Now, they say that you can have two QFPs on a project. However, from a contractual standpoint, when you don't bring CA services on and stuff like that, how do you get a QFPE qualified fire protection engineer to go over into construction and continue that oversight through construction? So one of the things that NAVFAC has done is they have a quality control fire protection engineer that is a contractor requirement under the 0145 quality control specification. So you then inherently bring that qualified FPE over into construction by making them part of the quality control organization for the construction contract. However, I've been in that role, and it can sometimes be like button heads because you also then have fire protection engineer requirements under your division specs, which is your division 21, your suppression systems, or even your division 28 fire alarm systems. So I've seen contracts get let and they'll have a fire protection engineer requirement for sprinkler, a fire protection engineer requirement for fire alarm, and a fire protection engineer requirement for the quality control. So you end up with 3 fire protection engineers on the same project hired by 3 different people, because the sprinkler contractor hires someone, the fire alarm electrical contractor hires someone, and the prime contractor hires somebody. So then I don't know if you've ever been in a room with multiple fire protection engineers, but they never agree on anything. So you run into this, construction issue with just having, kind of duplicating efforts and just confusion plus delays, because now you're talking about multiple people reviewing it. So it's one of them things that just is I think starting to work its way out through the UFGS specification requirements. It's not quite there yet, and it's also has to do a lot with the design firm putting the specifications together. Do they delete it out of certain ways or reference it to another one? So I know in a lot of the projects that I've been working on and putting it together, where we have multiple of these division requirements. So if we have sprinkler, we have fire alarm, we have fire pumps, we take out those fire protection engineering requirements and we reference back to that quality control fire protection engineer and make that person more responsible for overseeing all that. Or if it's a project that we know we're taking over for CA services, sometimes we'll get an agreement with NAVFAC to just cut out the contractor's fire protection engineer altogether and have a NICET certified designer stamping the drawing from a shop drawing level, and then it comes to GHD for review, and then by doing that, we maintain that qualified fire protection engineer through construction, and we don't bring in another fire protection engineer during by the contractor to muddy up the waters. So I've been on both sides. It does work either way. It really gets into the weeds of how these contracts are being let. And I can tell you, I've seen recently small renovation projects with very little sprinkler and fire alarm have these QC FPE requirements. So those contracts are out there and they're hitting the streets. And then the last one there is the commissioning agent responsible for fire protection. So this is I think we made up this acronym, like we did
That's
for most of
not
these.
true.
And I mean, if you see this being let in a contract, please let us know. We'd love to see if that's actually happening yet. But I think it's in the future, and I think as we start seeing more and more systems become integrated, you're going to see these requirements a lot more. I know there's been some big pushes in some of the fire alarm equipment and getting, I think it was, oh, Dylan, help me out here. Um,
I'm going back to the CXFP once you're done thinking there for a second.
what's the I'm blanking the name of the system, the HVAC system that controls everything. It's like an acronym.
The BAS?
Yeah. So they actually have those systems now that are becoming UL listed for fire protection, so that those systems can be used for smoke control and all that, so that you don't have to have separate systems doing the same thing. So I don't know if you ever got on one of these smoke control systems. You may have a damper already there, but then they have to put a second one in because you got to hook up a listed device onto it. Well, if that system is listed to a certain requirement, then you can just use that to perform the function of the smoke control system. So as we see that industry change of, at some point we're going to have a fiber optic port for everything, and we're just going to connect everything and it's all going to do what we want it to do. And then what? Who's responsible then? So I think that's that commissioning aspect's going to start to play into that role. But go ahead, take over.
Just to be able to pull some of the pieces together. Yeah, so that CXFP, that may not be in a contract document. That may be more in the commissioning plan, where you're a CX agent. That's basically the person that's going to be pressing the buttons out in the field. So they're going to be the person on your fire protection team, most likely the contractor, who's going to be out there operating the system, so that the commissioning authority commissioning authority and the AHGA can see that the systems work. So that's what that role is. So yeah, clear as mud.
Your favorite slide?
Yep, 100%. So the systems manual, that is the document. I'm not sure how much you touched on this, but this is the one that's sort of like the quick guide when you have an issue with your car. So it'll have like controls information, it'll have sequence of operations, it'll have your original OPR, the owner's performance requirements, the basis of design, the design calcs, blank checklists, pre-functional and functional, and then it'll have, if it's electronic, it'll have hopefully a BIM model all in there. So when you have an issue or you have renovations coming up or you have anything, you just go and grab your systems manual, and that tells you everything you need to know about your building, even more than your as-built would, because that'll tell you how it got designed, what their thoughts were. Just a really good in-depth document that's part of all the commissioning processes. But it's at the very end, and nobody really uses it until a couple of years down the road. So it just gets sometimes not incorporated as well as it could be. And you won't know that there's missing data until you're 5 or 7 years down the road and you have an issue with a system and you go, oh man, I wish it's like taking a picture of your house when you're putting drywall up. It's like, it's really nice and really cheap to get that data now than after. And then the operator training, making sure you get the right people there, not just sending the one person who's going to be maybe retiring in a year, and then they say, oh, we'll train the new guys, just send that person. And it's making sure that you get the whole team. It's really useful to get it directly from the source, whether it be the contractor or if they bring in a manufacturer to do the training, just to get that with everybody involved. And then same thing with the BIM integration, making sure that you're picking up anything that changes, making sure that you incorporate the maintenance items that some of the commissioning documentation will provide. so that when you have your BIM model of your building, once you walk away, it'll be a useful tool and not just sit on a computer somewhere. So I think that's just going to about wrap us up there. We got 15 minutes for questions if anybody has anything.
Feel like we're talking to an empty room.
Well, everybody's on mute, so I'm sure they're going to click it. Oh, I see some people coming off.
I might have missed this up front. How would we get a copy of these slides? Can we get a copy?
Yes, we will be sending out the copy of the slides after this webinar.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions for Matt or Dylan? Just take yourselves off mute or use the chat box. I don't see any in the chat box. Well, thank you again, Matt and Dylan, for sharing your valuable insight and expertise on commissioning in the SAME community. We appreciate your time, and we hope you might be willing to offer us some more webinar events for the future. I just want to reiterate this again. We plan to send out a follow-up survey to all attendees with a copy of the slides and recording of this presentation. Also, our education committee will be reviewing this presentation to determine eligibility for PDH credit. Any attendee interested in that is encouraged to contact us through our website at www.same.org/mid-Maryland. Thank you all again for attending.
No, thank you, Katie, for moderating. Thank you, Sammy, for having us on.